The day I was fired, I made a promise to myself that would change everything. Not just for me, but for every person who had ever been dismissed, overlooked, or cast aside because they didn't fit into someone else's narrow definition of worthy. What they didn't know when they escorted me out of that gleaming corporate tower was that they had just created their most determined adversary. My name is Catherine Miles, and this is the story of how I turned my greatest professional humiliation into a revolution that would shake the very foundations of corporate America. It's a story about power, prejudice, and the explosive reckoning that comes when you underestimate someone who has absolutely nothing left to lose. 3 years ago, I was a rising star at Meridian Financial Group, one of the most prestigious investment firms on the East Coast. I had everything mapped out: the corner office, the partnership track, the respect of my peers. I was 28, ambitious, and absolutely convinced that hard work and talent were all you needed to succeed in the corporate world. How naive I was. The morning of October 15th started like any other. I arrived at the 42nd floor of the Meridian Tower at exactly 7:30 a.m., my usual time. The autumn sun was casting long shadows across the marble lobby, and I remember thinking how beautiful everything looked. The polished floors, the contemporary art pieces, the perfectly manicured plants that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. It was a symbol of success, of achievement, of everything I had worked so hard to be part of. I had been with Meridian for 4 years, climbing steadily from junior analyst to senior associate. My performance reviews were stellar. My client relationships were strong, and I had just closed the biggest deal of my career the week before. A $30 million acquisition that had taken 8 months to negotiate and structure. The client had specifically requested to work with me again, praising my attention to detail and innovative approach to complex financial instruments. But as I settled into my cubicle that morning, reviewing the Henderson portfolio one more time before our 9 a.m. presentation, I had no idea that my world was about to collapse. The first sign something was wrong came when my computer access was denied. I tried logging in 3 times, assuming it was a technical glitch. When I called IT, the response was curt and uncomfortable. "Ms. Miles, you'll need to speak with HR about your access issues." That's when my stomach dropped. In 4 years at Meridian, I had never once had a computer problem that couldn't be resolved with a simple phone call. I gathered my materials for the Henderson presentation and headed to the 20th floor, where human resources was located. The elevator ride felt eternal. I kept telling myself it was probably just a security protocol update, or maybe they were upgrading systems. But deep down, I knew. You don't work in corporate America for 4 years without developing an instinct for when something is terribly wrong. Margaret Thornton, the HR director, was waiting for me in conference room C. She was a woman in her 50s with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and the kind of cold, professional demeanor that could freeze water. Sitting beside her was James Crawford, my direct supervisor, and to my surprise, David Blackwood, the managing partner of our division. "Catherine, please have a seat," Margaret said, her voice carefully neutral. I sat down, my portfolio still clutched in my hands. "Is this about the Henderson presentation? Because I'm ready to present in 20 minutes. The 3 of them exchanged glances. That's when I knew for certain that my career at Meridian was over. "Catherine," David began, his voice carrying that particular tone executives use when they're about to destroy someone's life while maintaining plausible deniability. "We need to discuss some concerns that have come to our attention regarding your recent performance and conduct." Performance and conduct. The words hit me like a physical blow. I had the highest client satisfaction ratings in my department. I had brought in more revenue than any other associate at my level. I had never missed a deadline, never had a client complaint, never even been late to a meeting. "I'm sorry, but I don't understand," I said, my voice steady despite the growing panic in my chest. "My performance has been exemplary. I just closed the Morrison deal, and the Henderson presentation is—" "The Henderson presentation has been reassigned," James interrupted. "We've had reports of erratic behavior, missed communications, and concerns about your ability to handle client relationships moving forward." I stared at him in disbelief. James Crawford was a man who had built his career on taking credit for other people's work and shifting blame when things went wrong. He was the type of manager who smiled to your face while systematically undermining you behind closed doors. But this was beyond anything I'd imagined he was capable of. What erratic behavior? I demanded. What missed communications? I want specifics. Margaret consulted her tablet. There have been reports of unprofessional conduct during client meetings, failure to respond to urgent emails, and concerns about your judgment in high-stakes situations. Every word was a lie. Every single accusation was fabricated. But as I sat there, facing three of the most powerful people in the company, I realized that truth was irrelevant. They had already made their decision. The meeting was just theater. "This is ridiculous," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to remain calm. "I want to see documentation of these alleged incidents. I want to know who made these reports. I want—" "Catherine," David said, his tone now carrying a warning edge. "Your employment with Meridian Financial Group is terminated, effective immediately. Margaret will walk you through the separation procedures." The words seemed to echo in the sterile conference room. Terminated, effective immediately. 4 years of my life, reduced to corporate jargon and legal formalities. "You can't do this," I whispered. "I have contracts in progress. I have clients who specifically requested to work with me. The Henderson deal alone is worth $40 million to this firm." "The Henderson deal will be handled by other associates," James said, not even trying to hide his satisfaction. "Your access to all systems has been revoked, and security will escort you to collect your personal belongings." That's when it hit me. The computer access issues that morning hadn't been a glitch. They had planned this. They had choreographed my humiliation down to the smallest detail. I looked around the room at these three people who held my professional future in their hands. Margaret, with her clipboard and legal documents, treating my career like a checklist item to be completed. James, who couldn't even meet my eyes, knowing full well that he was destroying an innocent person to protect his own position. And David, the managing partner, who had made millions off the backs of associates like me while maintaining the pretense of meritocracy. "I want to speak to Mr. Harrison," I said, referring to the firm's senior partner. "I want to appeal this decision." David's expression didn't change. "Mr. Harrison is aware of the situation and supports our decision. There will be no appeal." The finality of it was devastating. In the space of 15 minutes, everything I had worked for, everything I had achieved, had been stripped away. And there was nothing I could do about it. Security arrived 10 minutes later. 2 guards in navy blue uniforms, their expressions professional, but not unkind. They escorted me back to my desk, where I was allowed to collect my personal items under supervision. My colleagues watched from their cubicles, some with sympathy, others with the kind of morbid curiosity that comes from witnessing someone else's downfall. I packed my few personal belongings into a cardboard box, a small potted plant, a picture of my parents, a coffee mug from my college alma mater. 4 years of my professional life, reduced to items that could fit in a box the size of a shoebox. As I was escorted through the lobby, past the marble floors and expensive art that had once represented my aspirations, I felt something inside me shift. The shock and humiliation were giving way to something else, something colder and more focused. Anger. Not the hot, explosive kind of anger that burns out quickly, but the deep, sustained fury that comes from profound injustice. The kind of anger that doesn't fade with time, but instead crystallizes into determination. That night, alone in my apartment, I began to piece together what had really happened. It wasn't about performance or conduct. It was about power and politics, about who belonged in the inner circle and who didn't. It was about James Crawford protecting his own position by eliminating someone he saw as a threat. But as I sat there, surrounded by the debris of my career, I began to understand something else. Something that would change everything. 3 months earlier, I'd been diagnosed with a chronic autoimmune condition. It was manageable with medication and lifestyle adjustments, but it was the kind of diagnosis that required occasional medical appointments and, rarely, a sick day when flare-ups occurred. I had been careful to disclose this to HR, as required by company policy, and had worked with them to ensure that my condition wouldn't impact my work performance. It hadn't. My productivity had remained high, my client relationships strong, my work quality impeccable. But now, sitting in my apartment, I began to connect the dots. The timing of my termination, the vague accusations that couldn't be substantiated, the rush to remove me from the building before I could gather evidence or build a case, the reassignment of my clients to other associates who would undoubtedly receive credit for my months of hard work. They had fired me because of my disability. They had used my diagnosis as an excuse to eliminate someone they perceived as a potential liability, wrapping their discrimination in the language of performance management to avoid legal consequences. The realization was both devastating and liberating. Devastating because it confirmed my worst fears about the corporate world I had devoted my life to. Liberating because it gave me something I hadn't had before, a cause worth fighting for. I spent the next week in a haze of research and planning. I contacted 3 different employment attorneys, each of whom told me the same thing. Discrimination cases were difficult to prove, expensive to pursue, and often resulted in settlements that included non-disclosure agreements. Even if I won, the victory would be private and the systemic issues would remain unchanged. But I didn't want a private victory. I wanted a public reckoning. That's when I decided to take a different approach. Instead of fighting Meridian through the courts, I would fight them in the arena they cared about most, their reputation and their bottom line. I started by creating a blog called The Meridian Files, where I documented everything I could remember about the company's practices, culture, and treatment of employees. I was careful to stick to facts, avoiding any statements that could be construed as defamatory. I wrote about the pressure cooker environment, the toxic management practices, the way junior employees were treated as disposable resources. The blog gained traction slowly at first, then with increasing momentum. Former Meridian employees began reaching out, sharing their own stories of discrimination, harassment, and unfair treatment. A picture emerged of a company where success was determined not by merit but by politics, where diversity was a marketing slogan rather than a genuine commitment. Within 2 months, the Meridian Files had over 50,000 subscribers and was being cited in financial news articles about corporate culture in the investment industry. LinkedIn posts about the blog were being shared thousands of times. Anonymous tips were pouring in from current Meridian employees who were afraid to speak out publicly but wanted their stories told. But I wasn't satisfied with just exposing the problems. I wanted to create solutions. That's when I founded Disability Works, a nonprofit organization dedicated to advocating for disability inclusion in the workplace. We provided resources for employees facing discrimination, offered training programs for companies that wanted to create truly inclusive environments, and worked to change the systems that allowed discrimination to flourish. The response was overwhelming. Within 6 months, we had partnered with a dozen major corporations to implement comprehensive disability inclusion programs. We had helped over 200 individuals navigate workplace discrimination issues. We had testified before Congress about the need for stronger enforcement of the Americans with Disabilities Act. But my real target was still Meridian. I began reaching out to Meridian's clients, not to disparage the company, but to offer them something better. Through Disability Works, I had connected with a network of talented professionals who had been marginalized or excluded from traditional corporate environments. Many of them were eager to prove themselves if given the opportunity. I started a consulting firm called Inclusive Solutions, staffed entirely by professionals with disabilities or chronic conditions. We offered the same services as traditional financial consulting firms, but with a twist. We brought perspectives and experiences that had been systematically excluded from the industry. Our first major client was Henderson Industries, the company I'd been working with when I was fired from Meridian. They had been dissatisfied with the transition after my departure and were open to exploring alternatives. The project I had been developing for them was innovative and promising, and they wanted to see it through to completion. Working with Henderson again was surreal. I was providing the same services I had offered at Meridian, but now I was doing it on my own terms, with my own team. and with a mission that went beyond just generating profits. The Henderson Project was a massive success. We increased their portfolio performance by 18% in the first quarter, implemented cost-saving measures that saved them over $2 million annually, and restructured their debt in a way that improved their credit rating and opened new opportunities for expansion. Word spread quickly through the industry. Other companies began reaching out, interested in working with a firm that offered both excellence and values. Within a year, Inclusive Solutions had grown to 15 employees and was managing over $200 million in client assets. But the real vindication came when I received a call from David Blackwood. "Catherine," he said, his voice carrying none of the authority it had possessed in that conference room 2 years earlier. "I hope you'll consider this call a professional courtesy. I wanted to reach out personally to discuss a potential collaboration between Meridian and your organization." I let the silence stretch for a long moment before responding. "What kind of collaboration are you thinking about, David?" "Well, we've been following your work with great interest. The disability inclusion initiatives you've developed are impressive, and we think there might be opportunities for partnership. Perhaps you could come in and give a presentation to our leadership team about how we might work together." The irony was exquisite. The company that had fired me for having a disability was now asking me to teach them about disability inclusion. The people who had questioned my judgment were now seeking my expertise. "I appreciate the call, David, but I'm not interested in a collaboration. However, I would be happy to discuss Meridian's participation in our corporate accountability initiative." "Your what?" "It's a program we've developed to help companies address past discrimination and create genuine pathways for inclusion. It involves a comprehensive audit of existing practices, mandatory training for all management personnel, and the implementation of measurable diversity and inclusion goals with financial consequences for non-compliance." The silence on the other end of the line was telling. "Catherine, I think there may be some misunderstanding about what we're looking for here. We're interested in positive collaboration, not accountability measures." "I understand completely, David. And I'm interested in meaningful change, not cosmetic gestures. When Meridian is ready to have a serious conversation about addressing the systemic issues in your organization, I'll be here." I hung up the phone with a sense of profound satisfaction, not because I had rejected their offer, but because I had transcended their power to accept or reject me. I no longer needed their approval or their opportunities. I had created my own. The real transformation came 6 months later when the Department of Labor launched an investigation into Meridian's employment practices. It turned out that my blog had caught the attention of federal regulators, who had been receiving complaints about the company for years but had never had enough evidence to proceed with a formal investigation. The investigation revealed a pattern of discrimination that went far beyond my individual case. Meridian had systematically excluded qualified candidates with disabilities from consideration for positions, had failed to provide reasonable accommodations for existing employees, and had used medical information to make employment decisions in violation of federal law. The settlement was unprecedented: $50 million in penalties, mandatory implementation of comprehensive disability inclusion programs, and ongoing monitoring by federal regulators. More importantly, the case became a landmark precedent that strengthened protections for employees with disabilities across the entire financial services industry. But the most satisfying moment came when I received an email from a young woman named Patricia Wells, a recent graduate with a mobility disability who had been offered a position at Meridian as part of their court-mandated inclusion initiative. "Dear Ms. Miles," she wrote, "I wanted to thank you for making it possible for someone like me to work at a company like Meridian. When I was in college, I never imagined that a major financial firm would actively recruit someone with a disability. Your work has opened doors that I didn't even know existed." That email crystallized everything I'd been fighting for. It wasn't about revenge, though that had been my initial motivation. It was about creating a world where talent and capability mattered more than physical limitations or medical conditions. It was about ensuring that other people wouldn't have to experience the humiliation and injustice I had endured. Today, 3 years after that devastating meeting in Conference Room C, Disability Works has become one of the leading advocacy organizations in the country. We have partnered with over 300 corporations to implement inclusion programs, have helped thousands of individuals navigate workplace discrimination, and have successfully lobbied for stronger enforcement of disability rights laws. Inclusive Solutions has grown to 40 employees and manages over $1 billion in client assets. We've been featured in Forbes, Harvard Business Review, and the Wall Street Journal as an example of how diversity and inclusion can drive business success. But the real measure of our success isn't in the numbers or the headlines. It's in the emails from young professionals who tell me that they were hired because of skills rather than despite their disabilities. It's in the corporate executives who call to ask for guidance on creating truly inclusive workplaces. It's in the gradual but unmistakable shift in how the business world thinks about disability and inclusion. As I sit in my office today, looking out at the city skyline from the 25th floor of our headquarters, I sometimes think about that conference room at Meridian. I think about Margaret Thornton with her clipboard, James Crawford with his inability to meet my eyes, and David Blackwood with his cold dismissal of my appeals. They thought they were ending my career. Instead, they launched a revolution. The irony is that they were right about one thing. I was a threat to their way of doing business. I was a threat to the old boys club mentality that valued conformity over capability. I was a threat to the system that allowed discrimination to flourish under the guise of merit-based decisions. But what they didn't understand is that you can't eliminate a threat by firing it. You can only relocate it, and sometimes that relocation results in something far more powerful than what you were trying to destroy. Last month, I was invited to give the keynote address at the National Association of Corporate Directors Conference. The theme was Leadership in an Era of Accountability. And I spoke to an audience of over 2,000 executives about the importance of creating inclusive workplaces. As I looked out at the sea of faces, I saw Margaret Thornton in the third row. She was listening intently, taking notes, and when I finished speaking, she was among the first to stand for the sustained ovation. After the presentation, she approached me at the reception. "Catherine," she said, extending her hand, "that was a remarkable speech. I wanted to personally thank you for the work you're doing." I shook her hand, studying her face for any sign of the cold professional who had terminated my employment 3 years earlier. There was none. Instead, I saw something that looked like respect, even admiration. "I also wanted to apologize," she continued. "I've had a lot of time to think about the decisions we made at Meridian, and I realize now that we were wrong. Not just legally wrong, but morally wrong. What we did to you was inexcusable." It was the apology I'd dreamed of receiving, but now that it was being offered, I found that I didn't need it. The anger that had driven me for so long had transformed into something else, a sense of purpose that was independent of their recognition or regret. "I appreciate that, Margaret," I said, "but the real question is what you're going to do with that understanding going forward." She nodded seriously. "I've actually left Meridian. I'm working with a nonprofit now that focuses on employment rights. I'd like to think that our conversation today might lead to some collaborative opportunities." It was a perfect circle. The person who had fired me was now asking to work with me. The system that had rejected me was now seeking my approval. The power dynamics had completely reversed. But more importantly, the work was expanding. Margaret's transformation from corporate enforcer to advocate represented exactly the kind of systemic change I had been fighting for. It wasn't enough to punish the people who had discriminated against me. The real victory was in converting them into allies. As I write this, 5 years after that fateful morning at Meridian, I can honestly say that being fired was the best thing that ever happened to me. Not because I enjoyed the humiliation or the struggle, but because it forced me to confront the limitations of working within systems that were fundamentally flawed. If I had stayed at Meridian, I would have continued climbing the corporate ladder, achieving individual success while remaining blind to the systemic barriers that prevented others from having the same opportunities. I would have been complicit in maintaining the status quo that had ultimately victimized me. Instead, I was forced to create something new, something better, something that measured success not just in profits and performance reviews, but in the lives changed and opportunities created. The disability inclusion movement has come a long way in the past 5 years, but there's still work to be done. Every day, talented individuals are being excluded from opportunities because of misconceptions about disability. Every day, companies are losing out on innovative perspectives because they're afraid to step outside their comfort zones. But every day, we're also making progress. Every company that implements a comprehensive inclusion program, every manager who learns to see beyond physical limitations, every young professional who gets hired because of their skills rather than despite their disability represents a victory. The revolution that began in that conference room at Meridian has spread far beyond the financial services industry. It's changing how we think about talent, capability, and success in corporate America. It's creating a new paradigm where diversity isn't just tolerated, but actively sought out as a source of competitive advantage. And it all started with 3 people who made the mistake of underestimating someone who had nothing left to lose. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. Sometimes it's getting ahead so far that the people who wronged you have no choice but to follow your lead. Sometimes the best revenge is building something so powerful, so necessary, so undeniably valuable that the very people who rejected you come asking for your help. Sometimes the best revenge is turning your greatest defeat into your most meaningful victory. That's what I did, and that's what I'll continue to do, every day, until the world I'm building becomes the world we all deserve to live in. The fight isn't over, it's just beginning, and I wouldn't want to be anywhere else but right here, right now, leading the charge toward a future where everyone gets the chance to prove what they're capable of achieving. From that conference room to this corner office, from fired to fighting, from victim to victor. This is my story. This is my revenge. This is my revolution. And it's just getting started.